You can read D-Day by Stephen Ambrose and learn about June 6, 1944, or you can read about how Wolverine killed some Nazis in a comic book. Which one are you going to trust, okay? Recently, I had a friend reach out here in our church and he said, "Hey, Matt, what's going on with this book? Is this something I should take seriously?" And that book is Elaine Pagel's book, The Gnostic Gospels. It was a book that came out in about 1979, and this woman found these so-called Gospels and put them into this book. And the question is, are these Gospels, they're different Gospels than the four Gospels that are found in our Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Oh my gosh, the first time you hear about something like that, your mind is blown. I remember reading this book in college because I was like, oh my gosh, are there other Gospels? Are the ones we have ones we can trust? I wanted to find out for myself and read them. And maybe some of you are going to do the same, or you have done the same. Jason, have you heard about the other Gospels?
I have not.
Oh, yeah. And it's because there's not really other Gospels. Okay, but they're called that. There's things like the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Marcion, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of Peter, and the Gospel of Judas. And if you read books like the Da Vinci Code or see the movie, it talks about some of these things. And maybe you've read them in Pagel's books or in others. And the first time you hear about them, like, oh my gosh, what is this? Are there other stories about Jesus, or are the stories we have about Jesus not right because there's all these different things that have been written? But the reality is that they don't even compare. Feel free to read the book. I think it's kind of fascinating to learn some of the things that were written hundreds of years after Jesus died, because people had all sorts of ideas. But here's the reality. When you read those Gospels, it's a lot different than the Gospels in the Bible. And you can pick this up pretty quickly if you have any brains in your head. And I realized this pretty quickly because they contain stories about like Jesus as a kid. It's like filling in the gaps of what's not in the Bible. It's like when Jesus was a kid, he turned these clay pigeons into real birds, like the miracle of Jesus's childhood. And there's other stories about like Jesus's romantic interests in Mary. Ooh, that's scandalous. Or the fact that Judas really wasn't a bad dude. He's a tragic figure in all of this. See, these stories try to put a different spin or fill in the gaps. But when you read about them, they're just absurd stories. It's like reading a comic book compared to a history book. Now, earlier this year, I read a couple books by Stephen Ambrose about World War II. Stephen Ambrose is a great historian, and he was writing decades after the events of World War II, and yet he still was interviewing eyewitnesses, looking at original sources, going to the original locations like the beach at Normandy, and he wrote his history. So we trust it to be accurate. In the same way, the Gospels that we have were written by either eyewitnesses or people who interviewed the eyewitnesses, went to the original locations of Jesus. And that's the difference. It's like you can read D-Day by Stephen Ambrose and learn about June 6, 1944, or you can read about how Wolverine killed some Nazis in a comic book. Which one are you going to trust, okay? And that's really the comparison that I would make between the original four Gospels that are recorded in our scriptures and these other so-called Gospels that were written sometimes hundreds of years after Jesus had died and all the eyewitnesses is gone. So this is what we know about our four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is that they were written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew the eyewitnesses firsthand. They were written within a generation of Jesus' death. So when these guys quoted the real people who were there, you could go find these people by name, go to the location, and they were real people who could verify what had happened in these Gospels. And they were accepted widely by Christians from the very beginning and kept as scriptures. There's 4 different accounts, and they all tell one unified story about Jesus. If you look at all those other so-called Gospels, they were written long after the people who knew Jesus had died. They were written by people, and sometimes they had fake authors. Yes, they're called the pseudepigrapha, because pseudo means fake. People would claim that it was written by someone who had died hundreds of years beforehand, and they contradict what was written in those first 4 accounts. And some of you are thinking, well, you know, if it was written within decades, but even Stephen Ambrose's history books are written within decades, and we trust them. And if you look at the ancient worlds, what the 4 Gospels we have about Jesus, these 4 biographies, are incredibly close and accurate. Here's a crazy thing. Think about this. Alexander the Great. We all know he existed. We believe he was a historical figure, yet we only have 2 biographies about his life, and the earliest of which was written 400 years after Alexander died. Not so with the Gospels. Some of them, like Mark, which we think was probably the first one written, or some of the letters of Paul, talk about Jesus within 15 years of Jesus' death. That is early and accurate, and it all fits together. It's incredible. So I encourage you, actually read the 4 Gospels. And don't read these other Gospels. I mean, you can read them. It's kind of interesting. It's fascinating. But it's a comic book compared to a history book. In 2 Peter, Peter writes this: "For we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." And then in chapter 2, he says this: "But there will be false teachers among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord. These teachers will exploit you with fabricated stories." So watch out. There is something that's true and accurate, but there's also people trying to deceive us. There's fake news out there. So I think that we need to get a little smarter, and especially when we're reading and seeing this stuff on the internet. And to do that, I think we should quote from one of my favorite presidents, Abraham Lincoln, who said, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." Okay, be smart, people. Read the real stuff. Make sure you subscribe, like this, share this, give me a comment. I'd love to hear from you guys, and we'll be back with you next week.